Hey everybody, welcome to Partners in Promise Lunch and Learn webinar. We're so excited that you can join us today. We're going to talk a little bit about post-secondary transitions, life after high school.
Yes,
Joining
we
me
are.
today, yes, we are. Joining me today, we are so blessed to have Grace Kim, our founder and president of Partners in Promise of the board, and also a incredible special education attorney. And I am going to stop sharing right there because this is going to be more of a conversation, Grace. You know, both of us have young adults who have gone through this journey of transitioning from high school. And so I think that this is going to be a great session because we can kind of inform our military families who have kids with special needs, what to expect because it's not exactly easy to navigate this path. And so I'm thrilled that you can join us today. So tell us, first of all, for our listeners and watchers that are here today, tell us a little bit about your family and tell us a little bit about Josiah.
Sure. My husband, Joshua Kim, is a chaplain in the United States Air Force, and my son, Josiah Kim, was with us for a lot of the transitions that we have gone through as a military family. Karis, my daughter, is 16, so she's younger. She knows a little bit, but not quite as much as Josiah in terms of all that can transpire in the life of a military family, which I know that your family knows more than most. Josiah is now a 22-year-old adult. And what's very important for us to realize as parents is all that we went through from kindergarten through 12th grade has been building up to this, to now, the transition from high school into life, career, college, whatever it is that your child has in their future. This was the point of all of that.
And so, how do you think it's going? Because, when we talk about transitions, let's face it, we think about active duty transitions. There's all of this buildup of like, okay, my spouse is about to leave active duty. We got to think about preparing for where we're going to live next and what kind of job they might have as a civilian. And of course, maybe we can even concentrate on our own careers or figure out what we want to do. On the other side, it's always the thought about how to transition so, but really, this is kind of a thing for children with disabilities. There is actually law behind, this process of what do you do in your next step of
Yeah.
life. And so
I mean,
I
this
know
is
that
the
you are,
point.
yeah,
This is the
right.
point of the IDEA. The very essence of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is to prepare them for their future, which for you and me is
Right.
our kids now. It's here. It's here.
Yeah.
The law that would kind of govern the secondary transition planning is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a federal law that each of the states must incorporate. It is considered the federal law is a floor of opportunity. Each state is able to then take that floor and add on to it any additional rights, additional the parental rights, student rights on top of what's already written into the federal law. What's in there, this goes across the board. What's in the IDEA with regard to transition planning is that after the student finishes high school, college, and vocational training, or whatever it is that they want to do, and enters into the workforce, after that transition occurs, what is supposed to be the role of the caregiver, the parent, the community, etc. The IEP is meant to plan for the secondary transition. So a very important part and one of the emphases of the IDEA and the individual's IEP, the Individualized Education Program, is exactly that. This period of time when our kiddos are going from K-12 into this transition to adulthood.
Scary.
Transition planning is so important to do like early on. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say that's scary, isn't it? Like you think about for so long, we've had these eyes and we've kind of held the hands of our children all the way through this process. Um, And then to think that there's going to be that opportunity, like you said, for the further education, the employment piece. Um, do you feel like the IEP transition process works? How successful is that, for a lot of families?
I don't mean to laugh and just smile, but
I know, because I know
as
the
a
answer to
special
this. So,
education attorney, I get to see IEPs from children across school districts, across counties. I practice primarily in the Commonwealth of Virginia, although I do advise on some cases that are for military families that are outside of the Commonwealth of Virginia, some who are even stationed overseas. And I got to say, that secondary transition piece, everyone checks the box, they go through the motions. But a lot of times that plan, because you're supposed to have goals, you're supposed to have skills that the IEP is meant to address and develop. And it's also the transition portion of an IEP talks about various resources that are available for that child in order to meet the goals and to develop the skills. That process starts like the floor is age 16. But for instance, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, in Fairfax County Public Schools, for my son, that started at the age of 14. So they started 2 years earlier than the required 16. And I think that's actually better than waiting
yes.
until 16. Because by the time a student is 16, they're typically a sophomore, junior in high school, and their education is just about over, unless, of course, they continue through their 21st year of life. So by starting that planning, the transition planning portion of the IEP at 14, theoretically, we were able to kind of align Josiah's secondary transition goals and the skill areas that he needed to develop with what he wanted to do in the future. Unfortunately, of course, Josiah's goal was to be a contestant on The Voice. And so his IEP said that he wanted to be a contestant on The Voice.
Yeah, I think that there's something that we need to discuss too about the being realistic when we do that. So actually, you're leading me into something. So let me share this slide real quick, because you pointed out something that was important. It's the planning piece. I know that the floor is 16 years old, but there's some great states out there that have added more protection, so it can start as early as 14 years old, which is fantastic. And so I think that's the first thing our families really need to do is like, what is that age for the state that you're in? And ensure that you're involved in the process. But even before that, we've had this conversation many times. We need to start like planning like an elementary school, right? Because the trajectory that they're going to go on really can start at that beginning stage. And I know we've had many discussions with families regarding like where their child is receiving their services. What type of classroom is it credit bearing? Are they taking standardized tests throughout their elementary and middle school, because those credits are going to be important later on for them to get that standard. I mean, shouldn't we keep the expectations high at this point? I mean, we don't know what the potential is for any of these children, and so I think we want to keep the opportunities as open as possible. And I think maybe it begins way before 16 and 14. Would you agree on that?
Absolutely. It begins well, as soon as a kid steps foot into a school. That's when it begins. Or homeschool, whatever you choose to do as a family. In terms of what it is a child can accomplish or achieve, there is no reason to put a ceiling on our child's, future at the age of 3 or 4 or 5 or however your child is when they enter school. Let's expect the most for them, the greatest degree of independence possible. Let me use one of my
Yeah.
clients as an example. This client is non-speaking, but they are cognitively advanced. They do not learn in the same manner as other neurotypical children. They use a different communication system called Spell to Communicate, S2C.
Mm,
And the things that they communicate through what we call letterboarding or S2C are so eloquent and so beautiful. But the student was being placed in and marginalized and being pushed into those classes that were focused on functional life skills rather than academic skills. So their curriculum included things like sweeping a floor,
mm.
stacking blocks. I wish I was exaggerating, but he's in high school. His current IEP has an IEP goal that he will stack a certain number of blocks. Uh, and
Wow.
yet, when you read what this young man can write and is capable of, I mean, it's like high level intelligence and advocacy.
Mm,
So a person like that, when they were young, when he was in the single digits, he 100% presented like someone who may have some type of cognitive deficit or intellectual disability. But that could not have been further from the truth. He has a difference in the way that he communicates, but mentally, cognitively, he is fully intact and he's probably smarter than all of us, right? So if at that young age, the parents had agreed to place him in that functional life skills program, or some school districts have like two categories. They'll have what's called the category A for special and a category B, and one is considered the more severe presentation of student. Those will be your kids who are non-speaking, limited communication, have behaviors that are challenging for teachers to address. They will be placed in these courses or classes in which they're not going to be taught to read, write, and do simple math. They're just kind of,
there.
I don't want to say warehoused, but that's the feel. And those teachers are doing their darndest and their best. However, to put a ceiling on your kid's future without justification. Now, this is not the same for kids who have traumatic brain injury and other disabilities. Please hear me. But for kiddos who we don't know their actual cognitive capacity, and oftentimes we can't know their actual cognitive capacity until they've gained enough language and communication skills to share with us what they're actually capable of. So if you put a child who is so young, and I mean, so young that even neurotypical kids, they're not reading, writing, and doing, multiplication, division at kindergarten. But if at that time you put them into these courses or these classes that will not lead to a standard diploma, you're assuming a lack of competence, when instead we should assume competence. And
Absolutely.
that starts in the elementary school years.
Absolutely. I could not agree
You can tell
more.
I feel some kind of way
Yeah.
about this.
And that's why we have this webinar, because I do feel like after having had many consults, with Pip, it feels like parents are already predetermining what their child's uh, trajectory is going to be. And
Well, Michelle, let's take your
it
daughter
shouldn't
as
be
an
that way.
example.
Yeah.
In an IEP meeting, we had one of the administrators for the school district basically say, your daughter is not going to be able to do more than this. I can't remember the exact words, but her point was that your expectations were too high, that she had a ceiling to her ability and that it was here. And what we
Right.
were aiming for was too much. Well, somehow
Right.
Marissa Norman has graduated with a standard diploma in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and she
Or
earned
two of them.
it.
So yeah,
And she earned it.
she did. She worked very hard
So
for
can you
that.
imagine
Yeah.
had you just simply agreed to what this person was saying when your daughter was in elementary school? What would have happened? She would have never had the opportunity to take more challenging courses, to be able to strive towards a more independent future. We would have just boxed her in unfairly.
Right. And I think that is really important to stress to our families, because we are never somewhere very long. For someone to have eyes on our children, to see that development, over the years, to see, wow, they've really have come such a long way. But to continue to aim high. We have
Yeah,
research that supports
absolutely.
that. When you have those high expectations, if you take the have the long-term educational goals to graduate with a standard diploma, your outcomes are going to be much higher than if you didn't. So we need to ensure, and that's so, families, look, this is going to be a great little outline of what we're going to talk about today. But get the special education binder that we have, because tab 9 focuses straight up post-secondary transitions. And that's one of the things that, Grace and I are talking about is, you need to think about what that long-term educational goal is. And of course, we're talking here about, of course, graduating, there's so many things that you can do after you graduate, when you have that standard diploma, whether it be employment or going to a 4-year or a 2-year college, it could be, vocational training, whatever it could be, but, the opportunities are there for you. Or you can take a gap year and build up your resume and do other things. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the webinar, but I definitely download that binder, because we knew, and as we were putting together all of these resources, that there's going to be a time in your life where we need to start thinking about what comes next.
One thing I did want to add to that is, in order for that future that we're chatting about to occur, we have to recognize that only 1% of the school district population, by the way, should be placed on an alternate diploma track. 1%. It should never be because of administrative convenience.
Exactly. And I think you hit it on the head. I have heard so many times, oh, we were told we didn't have to take the testing because he's in special education, or, we're placing this classroom for XYZ. It's less than 1%. But, in our last survey, it was more like 23% of our families were not taking standardized tests. So why? Certainly they're not all significantly cognitively
I don't want to
impaired.
be like hugely dramatic about it, but it's kind of like theft. Except the theft, what they're stealing and robbing is our children's future. And of course, most times, and I've never met a teacher who was trying to harm the kids. No, not at all. Oftentimes it's kind of like, well, your kid really struggles when we give them grade level content or challenge them beyond what they're currently capable of doing. And we just, we don't want to see him in distress.
Right.
Got it. However, just because it's nicer or it's easier or it seems to make sense to you, the teacher, or whomever it is who's speaking, does not mean that legally that is what a school district is allowed to do. 1%, actually, ideally less than 1%, should be on this alternative diploma track.
Absolutely. So that's very important as you start this transitioning process, but sometimes it's a little too late. So that's why we're mentioning it now, because a lot of this can really start being determined in like middle school. And so
don't wait.
Find out what track your child is on, because there's some trickiness here in Virginia called the Applied Studies Diploma, which is not really a diploma. And so it's not a standard diploma. It's more like a certificate of completion. So that's a completely different track. And then, I don't want to go too far down this because there's so much to talk about, Grace, but let's admit it, certificate of completion just means you complete all your IEP goals.
It's a word game, because other states will call what Virginia calls an applied studies diploma a certificate of completion.
Right.
It's a word game. They get to say, we are giving your kid a diploma. It's a diploma that opens no doors. It's a diploma that they can't really do much with. Some community colleges may accept it, but they'll still require you to take entrance exams. That's right, not there. So in terms of then, what do you do? Start planning early. And by the way, if it's not early, if your kid is in middle and high school, it's never too late. It's never too late. But I would encourage you to please educate yourselves as parents before your kid walks across that graduation stage or is given a certificate of completion or what have you. Or is, the IDEA will only cover you through the 21st year, okay? Some kids get to stay through until they're 22. Others, they leave the moment they hit 21. So it depends on what you're in. Okay, just keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
Um, and after that, guys, you don't want to be scrambling to figure out what's next. There's
Exactly.
way too much Medicaid waivers, the, the, what is it called? The DARS, Department of Aging
Stars.
Rehabilitative
Yep,
Services.
we'll talk
You
about
don't
that.
want to be on the back foot. You want to be plan ready, already knowing what you're going to do and who you're going to be contacting for those resources.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk a little bit about them real quick before we kind of go too much down this road. The first thing on that tab is making sure that you sit down with your child and talk about your vision and goals. Like, what do they want to do? You would talk a little bit about
Mhm.
what Grace had mentioned about her son wanting to be on The Voice. That's okay. Sharing that stuff initially is wonderful. That form will help, guide them on what exactly are their strengths. What do they want to do after high school? So they'll just kind of like start having those conversations as a family. And then what are
Mhm.
your goals for your child too? Because that vision will help guide the IEP planning team when they put together this transition plan. So that's a really great form to fill out, and you can start that out in the middle school, but it just gets that conversation going with the child. Let's talk about that. What are the choices? You talked about possibly going to college or some other furthering education, employment, or staying at home and maybe doing other things to boost up their resume. So I know that Josiah has done a little bit of schoolwork and also worked at the same time as well. Do you want to maybe share a little bit about what a transition plan might look like for that to really,
Sure.
help them out?
So I wasn't going to let my kids' IEP secondary transition section say, I want to be a contestant on The
Yeah,
Voice. I mean, yes, it was in there as something that he expressed as an interest, and I supported him. Like I paid for vocal lessons, oh, sorry, paid for voice lessons. I paid for all of that. He took some courses while he was at community college at Northern Virginia Community College in music. But I also said, look, let's say you don't get on The Voice.
right,
What else do you want to do? And for a period of time, he wanted to be a teacher, is what he said. This was when he
mm,
was in high school. And so we made sure that his IEP secondary transition goals aligned to the goal of becoming a teacher. He talked about becoming a
okay,
history teacher or a music teacher. Well, we made certain that whatever skills those types of jobs necessitated were being worked on in the IEP. So for Josiah, that was communication, speech language. That was being able to self-advocate for what he needed, right? Because in order
right.
to become a teacher, you need to go to college. And when you're in college, you need to be able to advocate for what you need in terms of accommodations, etc.
Yes. Thank you for
So we made
bringing that
sure that
up because
we made
that's
sure that
so
his
important.
IEP secondary transition goals aligned with that. Very important.
That is very
Now,
important. I just have to interrupt for a second because I just
yes.
went to the inaugural Learning Disabilities Summit that NCLD, the National Center for Learning Disabilities, held this past week. And that's one of the big things that they found through their
Mhm.
survey of age 18 through 24-year-olds. They were not able to receive accommodations. I think it was a pretty high number.
Mm.
Stigma was part of the problem. They didn't want to feel like a burden, but they also didn't have the skills on how to self advocate for those accommodations because we're not taught that typically in those transition plans, right? Like, how do I speak to the disability office? Where is the disability office in the particular college? How do I speak to the professor once I have this piece of paper that says I need accommodations? A lot of times they will get that piece of paper, but they won't take that next step of like approaching their professor saying, I'm so sorry, I need help. So that could actually be part of that transition plan of like, how do they help? How do we help them self advocate? What are those ways of doing it? Okay, so
Well,
you can
what's
go ahead.
important
Sorry.
that you just mentioned, though, is that when they're in high school, the IEP case manager or whomever is working to make sure that administratively all of the students' teachers have a copy of the IEP, or 504 plan or whatever type of plan you might have, that staff person, school district staff person,
Right.
employee is doing that. when you get to college, if your child goes to a career, trade, or any sort of post-secondary institution, your kid's an adult. They need
Yeah,
to take it to their professors, to their instructors. So while the college may agree or the program may agree to give accommodations, they need to then, the individual needs to then let the teacher, let the professor, let the instructor be aware. Otherwise, no one's going to
not
find out.
happening.
It's on the individual.
Yeah.
And that's another thing. The IDEA ends in terms of the support, etc., ends the moment you are done with high school. So the moment you're done with high school, you're no longer protected by the IDEA. Now, Section
Right.
504, the Rehabilitation Act, does continue to apply to state colleges and universities, but doesn't apply to private colleges and universities. They may opt to follow Section 504, but they're not required to. The
Interesting.
Americans
So
with
the
Disabilities Act, though, that's universal.
Okay. So there is a difference on what
Oh, yes.
university that you go to and whether or not they have to comply. You can take the IEP accommodations part, though, and take it to the universities or the colleges, disability rights offices, and they can, if they accept it. Would that be acceptable? Because I know that there's been a lot of legislation about that recently.
State by state, depends. Some universities and colleges, even state universities and colleges, I could name names right now, but I won't. They can say no to the IEP accommodations you had or your 504 plan accommodations.
Right.
They can say you need to give us proof. And so another thing that we as parents and the students need to be aware of is oftentimes we have to provide up-to-date testing done at least within the last 2 years, I believe, for most, and be able to provide that depending on the area of disability. For my kiddo, it was a neuropsychological evaluation that he required in order to receive the accommodations. As well as he has some visual issues, so his vision doctor, we got all of those ducks in a row way ahead of
Well,
time. We planned out the future, like when Josiah was like in elementary school, we like mapped out a trajectory, very important, of
good for
where his
you.
life and career was going to lead. And yeah, and hey, it worked out real great for JoJo,
Yeah.
but it's not always that way, right? Not every student with a disability has a mom who's a special education attorney who is known by the school district as well as the community college that her kid attends.
He's kind of lucky in that respect. But I think you also mentioned, and it's really important, the updated testing. Definitely when your child is a junior or a senior, or if they have decided to stay in a little longer to their 22nd birthday, make sure before you leave the premises that they have at least a neuropsych that's up to date. I feel like that is something that's always used when we talk a little bit about the Medicaid waivers, the SSI. There's always a neuropsych that's being asked for. So if you have the opportunity to get that through the school, do it before your child leaves, right? Get
Yeah.
it updated because that's going to be necessary, I think, for something in the future. So
Yeah, you can
I'm
just,
that's great,
you can either do that privately or have the school district conduct it as a part of a triennial or reevaluation.
right?
Yeah,
But
I
definitely
would
don't
go
like
that. Mhm. I would
leave.
go that
Yeah,
route because the IEP you graduate with is a very important IEP, especially if you're going to pursue accommodations. Let me add though, some private
yeah,
universities and colleges give more support than what a public university and college might give. I'm thinking of one, I think in Arizona. Oh, don't quote me on this, but I do remember speaking. It was actually at the LDA conference that you and I spoke at for Pitt.
yes, yes,
I met representatives from a program that work with children or adults, I should say, students, university and college students who are on the autism spectrum, like my son. And they provided supports above and beyond, housing and executive functioning supports and communication
right.
and social supports and academic supports above and beyond what, like George Mason University here would have offered or do
That's
offer. Now,
great.
George Mason has a good program too, but this program was focused specifically on a population of students who often get left behind, not because they're cognitively incapable, but because they have other areas of need and deficit for which they need support, which prevents them
Right,
from being
right.
independent.
And I think that that is something worthy to note is that there are universities and private colleges out there that do cater to young adults that are neurodiverse. And so that's maybe a good way to talk about the GI Bill and scholarships that are out there for military families. But sometimes they do accept, those GI Bills, and they're a pricey tuition on an annual basis. So
Mhm.
definitely check to see if that's something that they would accept, because that could definitely help out with the price tag if your child desires to go to college. And there's other type of universities that have life skill college departments, so that even though you're not going to walk away with a certificate or a degree, at least you can experience the college life.
Mhm.
And so there's wonderful ones out there. I think there is one
Yeah.
at George Mason, if I'm not
It
mistaken.
is. It's mainly for individuals who have the awesome extra chromosome, our Down syndrome families. It's a great program and it's very
Yeah,
much integrated into the campus life of George Mason. Uh, but for kiddos
that's
like
wonderful.
Josiah, so like full disclosure, my son got into George Mason, but just his desires for what he wanted in the future, et cetera, we chose to send him to Northern Virginia Community College to just kind of ease into college and university. And he did great.
Right.
He got all A's and B's, and he had a lot of support though. And we can talk a little
Yeah.
bit about that later on. I know we want to talk about
Yeah. It
touch
feels like we
on
have so much.
touch on Medicaid. Oh girl, there's a
There's
lot.
so much, because then you
There's
talk
a
about the
lot.
community college, and big fan of
Well, let's
community
also talk
colleges.
about
So,
the
yeah,
programs that exist across the United States. Unfortunately, a lot of them in like the colder states. Like there's one up in Connecticut that's fantastic, one in the Chicago or the Illinois area. There's a couple down in Georgia, and their focus is that gap year that you talked about.
right,
Their focus is getting students who are not yet ready for independent college living. It's a program that works on the skills that they're going to need, and it does so in a structured setting that's kind of like a pre-college college. It's not high
right,
school. It's not quite college. And these programs are amazing. Some of them are residential, some of them are day programs, but
right.
those are fantastic stepping stones to get to the next step, even if it's not college, but just that next step of independence.
Um,
Yes.
all right. So the schools, I think we talked a little bit about what is necessary to see in that transition planning at when you're still in high school to prepare you for going to college. And I think we talked about the accommodations, get your neuropsych up to date, the GI Bill, the plethora of scholarships, et cetera. And then how to help these students self-advocate, because that's really important, because they're not going to talk to us at these universities and colleges. They have to learn this on their own.
And
Right.
every college and university, even non-public, even private colleges and universities, they're going to have a disability support office because they're required to by law. It's typically more of the ADA side of things, but
Right.
um, they can also provide accommodations through that office. So yeah.
That's fantastic. There's so there's so many resources out there that I think our families just don't know about. Uh, so Grace, I think we're going to pause here, because this has probably gone a little bit longer than we thought, and we haven't even gotten to the second part of it. So stay tuned for our next webinar, that we're going to talk a little bit more about those healthcare considerations. And is there anything else you'd like to say other than, obviously we need to keep advocating for our kids, and start early and download our binder.
The binder is key.
Yeah.
The binder is key, you guys. If you don't know where to start, we've given you somewhere to start. You can download the binder right off the internet and
That's
use it.
right.
It's fantastic. I wish I had something like that when Josiah first started his educational career. Unfortunately, I had to learn on my own. So key takeaways from today. I hope you
Yeah.
guys hear us that get that binder, use it,
Yeah.
ask us questions. We're here for you guys. We have a very robust website, and I'm
Yep.
sure that you could find a webinar or a podcast or something that can at least point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
Please make sure that you start educating yourself and your child about that secondary transition while they're still in school. Ideally, like from the start, but let's say your kid is in like middle school, high school, it's never too late. Let's start
Never
now.
too late.
Never too late. And all of that information should be available on the internet. Okay. Um, Oftentimes, school districts will even have an office dedicated to employment and transition services. That's usually like in the high school setting more than the middle school. It's not available in elementary. But make yourself familiar with what services they offer and what connections they have to make. And oftentimes it's just an email that you send to them saying, hey, do you provide me some information about secondary transition? And it's their job to answer your
Right.
questions. Anything else, Michelle?
I
There's a
think that
lot.
this is just
You
going to
said a
be
lot.
part one. This is just part
Okay.
one because I think we're going to have to split this up. There's just too much to discuss in just a short period of time. But you really staying organized, and that's really going to be key for part two. We'll talk more about that because, oh my goodness, we're going to need lots of documentation
Yeah.
for
We
all the
haven't even
things that we
started to
have to
talk
apply.
about like
And that's
power of
going to be,
attorneys, guardianship.
yes,
We haven't even
yes.
started to
So,
talk about the
yeah,
opportunities for independent living versus Medicaid
yeah.
and waivers.
That's part two. But definitely
There's
stay
so much.
organized. Yeah. And like you just said, start planning now. And then the part two, we'll talk about what happens when we're not here. Plan for us not being around. And how will your child survive and thrive? And I think
And
that's
thrive.
important.
It's not enough
Um,
to survive.
yeah, but to
We want
thrive.
our kids to thrive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so thanks for joining us and stay tuned for part two, where we will talk more about the health considerations and again for again the thriving piece of it. And thanks for joining. If you have any questions or comments, put it into Facebook or LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you and continue advocating and doing just being your child's best advocate. Appreciate it. Take care.